Hello, on Monday afternoon, December the 5th, 2022. I've been thinking about some things for quite a long time and been, I guess, delaying trying to post something as I've been trying to, get it exactly right. And I recognize that I'm never going to get it exactly right. And yet I keep trying. And the only result is I'm getting older and not getting anything out there so that I can hear back from you. So I've been working for several days now on trying to get something out there this year about Christmas and elections, a Christian perspective. And so I'm going to go ahead and I've typed something out. I'm going to, I guess, more or less try to read this to you so I can get these ideas out there. And recognizing that this is a work in progress, I hope to hear back from you. And then I hope to follow up on some of these ideas over the next several days and elaborate on some of the points that I just touch on here. So, on Christmas and elections, a Christian perspective. The Thanksgiving weekend is behind us, and we are full swing headed towards Christmas. Politically speaking, Democrats had more to be thankful for than expected, and Republicans had less to be thankful for than expected following the midterm elections. Both parties may have felt the same with former President Trump's announcement that followed the Thanksgiving weekend. Before the dust had even settled in all the legislative battles, President Trump, as expected, announced he was in the running for the Republican nomination for president for 2024. His announcement elicited less joy than he may have expected from Republican circles and more joy from Democrat circles and mainstream media than Republicans in general, as he is a lightning rod for motivating those who oppose him, a one man news generating extravaganza. Almost all the reviews that I saw characterized Trump's announcement as low energy. I only saw brief snippets of his announcement. Based on what little I saw, I thought the speech was characterized better by the commentator, who described it as a speech befitting a former president rather than the bombastic, made for TV introduction and campaign that characterized his first run for office. A very big question, however, is whether or not Republicans are trumped out, whether positive reviews of his accomplishments and the positives to which his diehard supporters can point outweigh the negatives associated with President Trump's way of being and being president. America's campaign for the 2024 presidential election is already underway as the world begins to focus on the Christmas season in 2022. The world is much different today than it was 2,000 years ago. Now is a particularly good time to reflect on what the Christmas message means for how Christians conduct themselves as citizens in America and the world in the 21st century. What is it that thousands of years of philosophical and theological thought can tell us as we analyze governance in the history of the world to justify our expectations for governance in America today? What is it about our long vaunted commitment to a wall of separation between church and state that it should inform how Christians approach electoral politics? Recently, I saw a brief video reviewing the rise of a movement that looks to President Trump as the best hope for America, Christian nationalism. The video was produced before the midterms. One of the messages of the video was that the midterms will provide a litmus test for what to expect in 2024. I have not seen a follow-up report on how Christian nationalists are interpreting the midterm results. I have not had time to review the positions of the individuals, groups, and ministries mentioned in the video to develop a better understanding of what they represent. Based on the name of the movement, however, and what I saw in the video, Christian nationalists are on the opposite side of the church-state spectrum than I when it comes to beliefs about how faith and politics should interact in order to realize the best environment for establishing a Christian nation. America is unique in the history of nations in the world. Her founding represented the culmination of millennia of religious, political, and philosophical thought within the framework of the West that grew out of the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, Greek philosophy, and Roman law. Modern political discussions, especially around Thanksgiving and the holiday season, include many commentaries and diatribes about the faults associated with America's origins. Nevertheless, central to America's founding was a worldview based on traditional Judeo-Christian principles brought over from her English and broader European roots. Insofar as America was founded on ideal principles to be lived out by fallible human beings, it is inevitable that she would and would continue to fall short of the goals for which she hopefully would continue to strive. In many ways, world history has been a history of struggle between the political and religious elements of society. Christian history is no different. From its founding as another sect of the Jews in the back corner of the Roman Empire, Christians had to reconcile their call to faith with the possibility that death might be the response of political leaders worried about a potential threat from the Christian faith to political stability. A key element of the Christian story is that the founder, God incarnate as God the Son, Jesus Christ, was crucified by the Romans under false pretenses according to God's will. During his ministry, Jesus had claimed that the opposition and challenges that his followers would face would be no less than he had faced. It is little wonder, therefore, that within a few decades after his death, Christians were being put to death for their refusal to reject their claim to faith in Jesus Christ. For many, no earthly sacrifice was too great, given the eternal context which would follow from how they had lived and died. Christianity's transition from persecuted minority to governing authority did not appear to impact the traditional expression of religious and political power. From the time of Theodosius I's declaration at the end of the 4th century that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity as a faith was at least implicitly involved in an often bloody struggle against non-Christian practices in the empire. Christian history itself is replete with examples of the power of the state being wielded in the name of, or with the implicit consent of, the dominant Christian theological perspective, even when the political and religious rivals both claim to be Christian. Nowhere is this more evident than in the context of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation launched a restructuring of Europe's religious and political landscape, initiating centuries of theological and political turmoil that factored into the establishment of nations and shifting alliances during some of Europe's most unsettled days. The religious wars of Europe were bloody and long, gradually drawing to a conclusion, in large part due to both practical political considerations and philosophical developments coming out of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, rather than a universal agreement on how best to live in peace as followers of a God who is love. The tension in national identity between procurer of material possessions and professor of eternal truths carried over as Europeans sailed to lands new to them. European ventures to the Americas often included a representative for an explicit Christian witness to whoever might be encountered. Representatives of the Roman Catholic Church often accompanied explorers from Spain and France, claiming the inhabitants of the land for the church, even as the land was claimed for the state. For the British and like-minded venturers from other European realms, religious self-determination was the objective of many who made the perilous trek across the Atlantic. Some of the early settlers were keen on establishing a beachhead for the Church of England. Others were keen on establishing a society in which they could continue to the Protestant tradition of establishing a new way of living based on their understanding of biblical teachings, often to the exclusion of others. For all who emphasized religious faith and practice, however, there was a common concern, not only for rightly reflecting the intent of God on earth in the present, but for what that reflection meant for the eternal future. As the colonists contemplated establishing a nation independent of Britain, many factors were at play in laying out a vision for how a new nation might be governed. A key component of America's founding was the effort to establish a political framework independent of any religious call to arms by which governance had been characterized in the past. Even so, the dominant religious influence on the social and moral underpinnings of the new nation was the Christian faith, recognized as such even by those who rejected many of the central doctrines of Christianity. Whether or not that makes America a Christian nation, in the same way that India is a Hindu nation or Iran is a Muslim nation, is a matter of discussion for many today. One might ask, therefore, whether being a Christian nation is a matter of law or of character. The Bible has a lot to say about how the world is and how the Christian ought to behave in the world. The world of America in the 21st century is different in many fundamental ways from the world in the first century, even though the fundamental questions facing individuals and the Bible's answers to those questions are unchanged. As Americans who call themselves Christians seek to work out what in the world that means, it might be helpful to consider the world's view of Christians, considering what has and has not been done in the name of Christianity over the last few decades. My understanding of Christian and philosophical thought suggests to me that under the auspices of the framework laid by the Founding Fathers, the Christian ought to pursue a political agenda which seeks the greatest individual and religious freedom possible so that every individual can live out the life that he or she believes ought to be lived, no matter who is in charge or what the majority claim to believe about God. If the history of America is the history of a nation that reflected Christian principles based on tradition and law without personal commitment to God, that America has been a whitewashed sepulcher. If the history of America is the history of a nation in which by choice individuals have recognized in Christianity a belief system that fostered individual change based on relationship with God, which then impacted how the individual lived his or her life in relationship with others in the world, then the character of the nation would reflect her claim to be under God. It would be an eternal tragedy if Christians insist on means of securing political influence or modes of governance that depend upon outdated social and political frameworks and thereby obscure the eternal message which Christians are called to proclaim. The Founding Fathers recognized both the potential and the peril in establishing a nation of law in order to foster liberty. Central to the success of their venture was the recognition that a commitment to liberty means a commitment to liberty for ideas and behaviors with which I disagree, in addition to ideas and behaviors with which I agree. As is true with every body politic, there will be social, cultural, and legal limits placed on the behaviors in which individuals and groups can engage. But the more we seek to legislate how everyone must behave, even in private, the greater the threat to our own pursuit of individual freedom. One of the challenges we face as a nation is deciding how we will respond to our national history of successes and failures in living up to our founding ideals. Should we abandon the effort altogether in hope of building a better nation on a foundation based on other, perhaps lesser ideals, or will we be inspired to recognize our own frail mortality as we face up to the ideals in the hope of living a better example for future generations to follow? Christians have a chance to speak to how we can both maximize liberty for all in support of the ideals espoused by the founders, while fostering a context in which America's character reflects the ideals of the Christian message and the philosophical history in which America was born. How Christians speak and live in light of the challenge to impact our national identity will matter more than the legislative and electoral wins that are recorded in the short term. The ends do not justify the means, especially in a democratic election. Likewise, the means do not always indicate the ends. Just ask the one born to lay in a manger and die on a cross. So my basic point in this thought process is that as we approach the Christmas season, from whatever perspective we approach the Christmas season, but particularly from the perspective of Christians, we ought to keep in mind that it's not just how we celebrate Christmas or what Christmas means to us personally, but it's how we live our lives, even as citizens in what I would say is the greatest nation the world has ever known. And that bears greater testimony to what we ultimately believe than what it is perhaps that we say or what slogans we carry on our signs or even who we vote for. How, in fact, do we live our lives in relationship with others, whether or not they say or think or believe or act exactly the same way we do? And what are we doing in self-reflection to consider how, in fact, we are living in and impacting the world with respect to what we say we believe ultimately matters? Well, that's all I want to say right now. I'll follow up on all these ideas down the road and look forward to seeing what you have to say in response. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.